This is the current Walking Dead timeline. Yeah, it's a bit of a mess. It's safe to say that The Walking Dead has become something much bigger than itself. What started off as a single show has now expanded to multiple spin-offs that take place in different periods of time. While this in itself isn't necessarily always a problem, having a timeline that is all over the place can potentially cause a disaster. Because now not only do you have to make sure your spin-offs fit in with the current world lore, but you also have to make sure you don't mess up the timeline, which is the current predicament that we are in today. Now, the main show throughout the years has had many time jumps between seasons, but there's one time jump in particular that I think just blew everything out of proportion and made the story confusing. I'm of course referring to the 6-year time jump in season 9. So what made this time jump bad? Well, that's a question that has multiple answers to it. First, we need to see what caused all of it. So let's rewind the clock and go back into the early days of The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead, when it first came out, was pretty different from other zombie movies and shows. One of the key differences about this show was the fact that it took place in the early days of the apocalypse. This meant that the show would place a focus on the downfall of civilization and explore how people in society can degrade and change into something else. It was actually a pretty cool and unique concept for zombie media. One of the highlights of the show in the early days was its characters. Because the apocalypse was just beginning, it had a very realistic approach to how it took its writing and world building. The main characters we focused on were pretty much just your average people who had to adapt to survive. And fans of the show loved this. We had to see characters like Glenn, who was just a pizza delivery boy, turn into more of a moral compass for the group. But we also explored a dark side of people in the apocalypse as well. Remember how I said that this show explored the collapse of society? Well, that's exactly what it did well in its first 8 seasons. A character like Shane started off as a police officer, but over the course of 2 seasons would become further and further derailed until he attempts to kill Rick. Other villains, like the Governor Negan, who once had families and were just regular people, would become psychopaths and villains of the show. And it wasn't just the villains that had dark sides either, it was also the protagonists of the story. The group throughout the seasons would commit some pretty questionable acts. Looking at you, Murder Jacket Rick.
What?
It was crazy seeing how the show could take everyday people we know and turn them into something else. It was what The Walking Dead did so well. It's what made it so compelling. The dialogue and settings were really gritty and smaller scaled and told a very character-driven story. And because Apocalypse just began, no one knew what was going on, and it made it really feel like this could actually happen in the real world. But of course, the story had to continue to move on and progress over time throughout the next seasons. And finally, we got to the point of season 8, when the showrunners felt like that The Walking Dead needed a reboot after the disappointment of the Savior arc. So how did they accomplish it? Well, they did a thing we call a time jump. Now, this actually wasn't a bad idea at all. It only jumped about 18 months in the future. I feel like this was the breath of fresh air that we needed after season 7 dragged down way too long, thanks to Scott Gimple. It gave us time for the characters to move on from that and go back to the days of where The Walking Dead was great. And it did feel like the show was good again in the first few episodes of season 9. Of course, some of the best characters were no longer around, but the story was decent and the pacing was good. But then we had just another slight problem: Rick's departure.
Oh, no.
Rick, up to this point, was kind of an essential part of the story. I mean, he was literally the main character and was pretty much on every promo. So to have a character like this leave, but also need to continue the already existing story, was a challenge for the writers. So how did they overcome it? Well, they did another time jump. Now, for a little context with the timeline for anybody who is up to date on it, seasons 1 through 8 only take place about the course of roughly 2 years. I know it doesn't seem like that with the time we've had to wait in between seasons, but they only had like 2 major time jumps that spanned a couple months. Which is just crazy when you think about, like, a majority of the events took place in such a small fraction of time. But regardless, only 2 years had passed between seasons 1 through 8. With season 9 having this time jump in its first episode, the story at this point was roughly 3.5 to 4 years since the beginning of the apocalypse. So with that context in mind, season 9 relatively was only a little bit further ahead than where season 8 left off. It was still believable and easy for the show to still feel familiar but fresh from its original premise. However, of course, that wasn't the only time jump that took place. And later on, during season 9, after the 5th episode, they would do another major time jump. And when I say major, I mean 6 years. That means that we had more time pass in a single episode than the run of the entire show. And it's not like time jumps are a foreign concept in shows and movies. I mean, a couple shows I can think of that do this are like The Last of Us and House of the Dragon. And I mean, say what you will about House of the Dragon season 2, but the first season was pretty good. The difference with those time jumps, however, is that they were for establishing the world and narrative. They don't alienate the story because it happens so early on and introduces you to the characters. But The Walking Dead, in contrast, decided to jump a massive period in time in the middle of its 9th run, just 2 seasons before the show would have its end. I don't think I've ever heard of a show ever doing this before. And my guess as to why the showrunners decided to do this was to have a reason for the characters moving on past Rick's departure. But do we really need that much time to pass for the characters to move on? I mean, really? 6 years? How long does it take to get over somebody? And okay, don't come at me, Rick fanboys. Like, I love Rick, but 6 years is a bit much for one character in the show. You guys have to remember that we've had multiple character deaths happen in the show before, and our characters have had much less time to move on and continue the story. But what I also don't like about this is the fact that so much time has passed, but yet it feels like nothing had changed in the show at all. Besides, like, everybody's hair getting, like, a little bit longer. Like, literally the first episode of the time jump, we see that Daryl is still looking for Rick's body in the water, which doesn't really make too much sense when it's been 6 years and he never found a body. I mean, you think he would have gave up at some point? And if Rick was supposedly alive, he would have returned. But, you know, whatever. I don't quite understand it, but maybe I'm missing something there with why Daryl kept searching for his body, but to me it just wasn't believable at all. And then with the rest of the group, the only thing that really apparently occurred is some group of kids showed up and the communities further distanced themselves. That's pretty much it. Remember when our group had like to deal with multiple zombie herds, the governor, the wolves, and Negan, all within the span of months? And now you're telling me that nothing major had occurred in the last 6 years? Yeah, I don't find that very believable. You could say that the first 8 seasons should have spanned over a larger amount of time, and yeah, I can agree with that. But regardless, I think 6 years is way too much for a show like this to try and be different and then yet not at the same time. Which makes me really think that there's only one other major reason for why they decided to do this. And that was, of course, Judith. They clearly wanted Judith to become the future of the show, and in order to do that, she had to be older. I mean, she was literally only 2 or 3 years by the time of season 9. So I do agree that her being older was a benefit for the show, but you know, maybe if you hadn't killed off someone else in an earlier season, this would have not been a problem at all. Just saying, like, it would have been so preventable. Yeah, overall, I was not happy with this time jump. I know many fans felt like this was a needed reboot for the show, but if the show has to change that much, then that raises the question if the show should just end. Because there's only so much they can change from its original premise before it becomes a shadow of its former self. Had the show ended around season 8, I think they could have wrapped up the story much better. Of course, it would need a bit of a rework, you know, to make it actually be a better ending and have all the arcs wrap up properly, but I think it would have fit thematically better than what they did later on. Hell, they could have even ended at season 5 when the group arrived in Alexandria. It would have ended in the early days and we get to see the characters living peacefully and happily ever. If they constantly need to change the story narrative so much by introducing a massive time jump, then I think it's a sign that you're going on for too long and just adding on more for the sake of adding on. Because after the middle of season 9, the rest of the show feels pretty different, for better and for worse.
Are you just gonna leave that mask on?
Does my true skin disturb you?
What? A lot of the realism and natural dialogue of the show had going for it was just gone now. Characters had adapted to the apocalypse now, so there was no excitement for the unknown. Everyone knew how to survive, and I missed the little moments we had back then when people didn't know what was going on. Like the discussion about what the walkers are between Rick and Herschel, or remember that moment that we had all the way back in season 1 where Brenner discussed what caused the virus, and then Rick reveals it later to the group?
We're all infected.
What?
These moments really made the early days feel special. Because we knew so little about the actual disease, it really made it feel like more was going on in the world around them. There was so much uncertainty and unknown, and to me that always made it more terrifying. All these moments could happen because the show was still taking place in the beginning. It felt real enough to where you could see this happening in the real world. Now, it's not to say the time jump was all bad. There were still some positive things that came out of it. Of course, we got to separate ourselves from the Saber arc even further, which I think many of us can agree was good. We also got to see what happens when the characters had to rely on horses and medieval weapons, which kind of brought this new rustic tone for the show, which really fit the apocalyptic setting really well. These were all positive elements to The Walking Dead, and the narrative still relatively followed the same story as the comics. But there's just one little problem here. The spin-offs. Had The Walking Dead just been a single show, I think the timeline would have been easy to follow for the average viewer. But this wasn't just the only show that took place in the universe. Because of course, AMC is really greedy. Fear the Walking Dead just had its 4th season right before season 9. For the most part, the show had been a prequel that took place in the first couple of weeks after the apocalypse. But because the main show jumped 1.5 years and Morgan was joining Fear the Walking Dead, they also had to do a big time jump, which meant that the show would abandon all the buildup that it had in its 3rd season, just when the show was finally finding its footing. But hey, at least now it's finally caught up to the main show, right? Well, actually, turns out it's not. Because now, The Walking Dead would then jump ahead another 6 years. Now it meant that we would know that Morgan and Dwight would never return to the main show, which really annoyed me because season 4 of Fear the Walking Dead teased multiple times that the main group come back to Alexandria, and we just knew it was never going to happen. I would have been fine with Fear being a separate show that didn't connect to The Walking Dead if it wasn't for Morgan joining, but that's a different discussion for a different day. I just feel like at this point, somehow the shows would have to connect, but they never did. Fear would never catch up to the timeline until its final season, which I asked the question, what's the point of doing that when you even tell the majority of your story in the first 3 to 4 years? I think, in my opinion, it just makes it more confusing and messy. I would have respected the show more if it stuck to its own thing and timeline, but they didn't. And this isn't the only problem with the Walking Dead timeline, because of course, the show has to have multiple spin-offs that span multiple periods of time. World Beyond was pretty easy to follow, with it being relatively close to this 10th season of The Walking Dead, but with the CRM being the story now, it also raised the question of what happened to Rick. He left 6 years prior to the current timeline, so how are they explaining that massive jump? Well, basically he spent most of that time recovering and attempting to escape. While the writers did provide an explanation to his disappearance and absence, it still felt like something that had to be forced in order to make the show work, which leads me to my next criticism of the time jump. Because I feel like it has broken up a lot of the continuity and pacing of the overall story. The Daryl Dixon show is also pretty easy to follow in the timeline, with it only taking place relatively a year after The Walking Dead. But where it really gets confusing here is with the other two, Tales of the Walking Dead and Dead City. They really mess up the timeline. So Tales of the Walking Dead supposedly spans somewhere around 15 years of time in the universe, with some episodes taking place in the early days of the apocalypse and some taking place much later on, with supposedly one episode taking place all the way up to 15 years in the future. And some of these episodes don't even know where they take place at all. And if that wasn't complicated enough, they even had the audacity to throw in a time loop into the mix. What have we become here? And then that leaves us with Dead City, which up until this point is the furthest show on the timeline, supposedly taking place all the way in 2029, roughly 19 years after the apocalypse started. How the hell did we get here? We spent roughly 8 seasons in The Walking Dead taking place over the course of 2 years, and now in the last few years of this universe, we've spent nearly 20 years of time? Do you see how this gets just a little bit confusing? It just leaves so many questions here. Like, did Maggie ever reunite with Rick 6 years ago? Is Morgan still looking for Rick? Whatever happened to the CRM? Why haven't they taken over New York and other places? There's just so many problems this raises for the writers. And now, I know some of you might be asking, but Mason, who cares about time jumps and realism if the narrative and story is still good? I mean, after all, this is a show about zombies, so it's never been quite that realistic. And by having a flexible timeline, they leave room for more stories. And yeah, okay, that is a fair point, but here's the question I ask. If you change your show so much from its original purpose and premise, then at what point does it just lose its identity and become something else that it was never meant to be? Like, it's clear from the showrunners constantly doing time jumps and what are essentially reboots that they were just changing up the formula to give us more content and stay relevant. And if we're being brutally honest here, most of the content that we've gotten from the last couple of years have ranged from terrible to mid at best. Like, it's like the showrunners are attempting to make their own MCU, but forgot to make an impactful character-driven story, which, funny enough, is pretty much the same problem that Marvel is facing with phases 4 and 5. Both of these universes have no problem changing the timeline and constantly experimenting with different spin-offs, and yet they've both fallen flat in the recent years. And not only that, but it's just becoming harder and harder for new fans to get into this universe when there's so many spin-offs taking place at different periods of time. Let's just imagine you're a casual fan of The Walking Dead for a second. You just finished season 8, and you hear about Morgan leaving. So you might be wondering, well, what happens to him? Well, it turns out he went to this other show called Fear the Walking Dead. Well, you better go back and watch that show now. But should you watch the first 3 seasons, which have completely different characters and almost nothing to do with the 4th season? I mean, you could argue that with Madison and Nick now being dead, there's really no point of watching them. So, okay, let's say you start with season 4 then, and you watch all the way up until season 8. Well, actually, it turns out Madison is now back in the show. So you better go back and watch the first 3 seasons of Fear the Walking Dead now. And oh yeah, that's right, we also have a major time jump in our final season as well, right in the middle. Essentially rebooting the show again right before it finishes. So you finally finish Fear and you catch up on the rest of The Walking Dead. Well, since Dead City's just released, you're probably thinking, okay, let's continue to watch Negan and Maggie's story since it just ended off with a teaser. So you finally finished that. And then now there's the Daryl Dixon show. This came out the Dead City, so surely this would take place after in the timeline, right? Nope, actually turns out it takes place 6 years earlier. Make sure you don't get that mixed up, by the way. And oh, do you remember Rick and Michonne? Well, you better go figure out what happened to them with the ones who live. And are you wondering why Rick doesn't reunite with Daryl at the end? Well, actually turns out he's in France during the events of this. Okay, well, what about Maggie? Well, we don't know. He's never mentioned in Dead City, so maybe they never reunited at all, even though there was a supposed 6-year time gap between the shows. And do any of these spin-offs mention the events that happen in the other shows? Nope, because they just constantly add random things as time goes on. Do you see the problem here? So yeah, the Walking Dead timeline is a mess right now. It has progressively gotten worse and worse over the years as more spin-offs have been added. As I went to make this video, I had to constantly check multiple sources and videos to get an idea of where each show took place. What even made this worse was the fact that some of the information I found contradicted each other. Like, some said that Dead City takes place in 2025, and then some articles were saying that it took place in 2029. So I was like a little bit confused on where to place everything in the timeline. I tried my best to give the most accurate information here, but I apologize if I messed up on some of the dates. It just really goes to show you how confusing this all is. But overall, that's not even the biggest problem about the timeline. As I mentioned earlier, the need to push the story further and further in order to add more spin-offs is a sign of a franchise stretching itself too thin. When none of these shows bridge the gap of the years that occur between them, I have to ask, where is this all going? Well, I personally don't think this is going anywhere. I think that this show doesn't care about the continuity of its timeline, and instead it will just go wherever with it in order to produce more content, which makes me sad because I don't think we'll ever see a proper conclusion to this universe. The Walking Dead just simply refuses to die. But what do you guys think about all this? Should they continue the universe and timeline and keep producing more spin-offs? Or do you think they should just let it die out before it becomes something entirely different than its original self? Let me know in the comments down below. Other than that, guys, that's going to be a wrap for this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.